Much ado has always been made about the madness of House Targaryen, and one of the largest unanswered questions regarding it is whether it's driven more by nature or nurture. But the addition of Aegon the Conqueror's vision adds an incredibly interesting dimension to the supposed insanity of the Targaryen dynasty. Although House of the Dragon doesn't seem to be making this plot point into a focus of the series, it's very difficult not to speculate what kind of an impact that it has already had on Viserys' reign, and how it will influence Rhaenyra and her decisions going forward. While House of the Dragon does focus on a particular era of political upheaval, the potential repercussions that this family lore may have had on the entire Targaryen dynasty is actually far more interesting. The power of prophecy in the world of Ice and Fire is oftentimes not driven by the meaning of the words themselves, or the actual intent behind them. Foretellings are typically and seemingly intentionally vague, and the liberties that those who interpret them can take with their true meaning is generally more impactful than the visions themselves. Obviously, the most relevant aspect in this instance is represented in Aegon the Conqueror himself. If Viserys' words are to be believed, then Aegon invaded Westeros in order to save them. Or at the very least, that's what he believed that he was doing. The colonialist and imperialist critique is implicit in this notion, and given George R.R. Martin's broadly anti-war beliefs, it's doubtful that he wants the audience to accept the idea that Aegon used his lizard nukes to subjugate an entire continent that he knew nothing about because he was secretly their savior without questioning the validity of Aegon's belief. But political implications aside, the integration of this prophecy as a potential cornerstone of the Targaryen dynasty is fascinating and offers an incredible amount of insight into the unreliability and toxicity of the entire Chosen One character archetype. It also seems to explain a lot of what most people in Westeros would likely perceive as Targaryen madness. Targaryen madness has always been an interesting facet of their entire family, and the question of how much of it is nature and how much is nurture has remained unanswered. However, this seems to put a whole lot of weight into the nurture column. There are two dueling aspects that make this prophecy exceptionally dangerous in relation to House Targaryen specifically. The foretelling is presumably of a single leader who will unite the realm and basically save the world, which is an incredibly frightening thing to tell anyone in a family who has already been raised on the belief that they are gods among men. If the Targaryens were aware that there was going to be one apex Targaryen who would outshine all others in the annals of history, then it comes as no surprise that a bunch of people who already think that they're obscenely important would presume that they were the chosen one and that their specific beliefs and skill sets were exactly what was needed to save the realm. As an early example, if Rhaenys and Visenya were aware of this prophecy, which seems likely, and if the rumors of Visenya's murder of Aenys are true, it actually illuminates the entire reign of Maegor the Cruel in a completely different light. Yes, he was a horrifically brutal leader who mistreated everyone, but if Visenya believed that Aenys was simply too weak to lead anyone, then her repulsive familicide at least becomes more comprehensible. And she's hardly the first or last person who gave little thought to killing one of their own for the supposed greater good. It also makes Maegor's madness even easier to understand. He was a terrible ruler, but if he genuinely believed that the end of the world was coming, and that Westeros needed a strong king who was ready and willing to fight any threat, then his unhinged behavior actually does have a certain measure of logic to it. But clearly, that logic is an extension of Maegor's own beliefs and desires. He would likely believe that he was meant to fulfill this destiny, and therefore all of his actions, choices, and skills would be exactly what the world needed in order for it to be saved. This of course makes things really interesting in a broader context, because in reality, kings like Maegor the Cruel and Baelor the Blessed could have been working towards the exact same goal based on the exact same information. But because of their individual biases and their own sense of self-importance, they both seem like they're completely out of their minds in entirely different ways. One of the most valid critiques of the introduction of the prophecy is the notion that it has been passed down from ruler to ruler, because there is a certain kind of reason to that as well. Yes, the observation that keeping this rule of two going is an enormous risk because the king and heir could both die without sharing this vital information is an accurate one. But the reasoning behind keeping it a secret seems even more important. The most vital reason for keeping it hidden is also one of the most pragmatic ones. Again, going back to the dangers of Targaryen superiority. If every Targaryen is aware that there is one super special snowflake to end all super special snowflakes, then it's not hard to envision a world where they start killing each other off and usurping the throne because each one of them believes that they are the most important Targaryen. But there's also a kind of circular, chicken or the egg logic behind the secrecy that also makes sense from a more narcissistic perspective. Most people want to believe that they're special, and that desire is amplified 1,000 times over for the Targaryens. By keeping Aegon's prophecy to themselves, they're largely ensuring that they or someone of their bloodline must be the fabled hero to end the long night. With that caveat in mind, it's clear that Targaryen madness isn't 100% caused by this prophecy, as there are plenty of members of House Targaryen who did incomprehensible, illogical things and presumably had no idea that the ice apocalypse was even a thing. But as far as Targaryen leadership goes, it's both incredibly interesting on its own and a wonderful explanation of the power, pointlessness, and destructiveness of prophetic obsession. Maegor the Cruel's abuses and brutality undoubtedly would have made sense to him if he truly believed that these choices would save everyone. His decision to force women into endless marriages, his desperation at producing an heir, and his rage at the failure to do so is repugnant. But again, easier to comprehend when he thinks the entire world is at stake. Baelor the Blessed's fatal devotion to piety seems foolish on its face. But if his interpretation of Aegon's vision was that the entire realm needed to be united through faith, and that reverence of the gods was the only means of defeating the coming storm, it's easier to fathom. Aegon the Unworthy certainly seemed to live up to his nickname, and his decision to legitimize all of his bastards prior to his death created chaos and repeated wars in Westeros. But he was a terrible ruler, and it's not hard to imagine a world in which an unfit king essentially wanted to hedge his bets on the Targaryen savior, and therefore gave all of his children potential claims. Ironically, Aegon the Unlikely was actually a quite capable and benevolent king, and he seemed to be a reasonable and measured man. Ergo, the fact that this seemingly capable and reasonable king accidentally killed himself in what appears to be a failed attempt at a magical ritual at Summerhall is baffling, but all the more tragic and senseless through the lens of Aegon's prophecy. Aegon V seemed to have the best interest of the people at heart, so if his ancestors' vision convinced him that the dragons were a necessity to save everyone from the coming doom, then his accidental death is easier to comprehend but still brutally pointless. And of course, the most interesting and immediately relevant aspect of the ripple effect of this prophecy comes in the form of the Mad King Aerys and his son Rhaegar. Rhaegar's obsession with prophecy is already legendary to begin with, so the addition of Aegon's beliefs about a Targaryen who needs to save the world would only add to Rhaegar's so-called madness. Once again, there is a great irony to the mental poison that prophecies can become, because by all accounts, Rhaegar could have been a good king. But his ability to rule was likely hindered far more than helped through his preoccupation with prophecy. Similarly, although Aerys' reputation was far different from Rhaegar's in the end, he began his reign as at least a functional king, and in the end oversaw and inspired the complete collapse of House Targaryen. However, the notion that both of them were aware of and believed in Aegon's prophecy paints their choices in an entirely different perspective. Aerys was undeniably and unnecessarily brutal, but killing the Stark Lord and heir alongside the litany of lords that were killed in the build-up towards Robert's rebellion makes a bit more sense if Aerys believed that he needed to unite the realm no matter what, because Westeros was headed towards certain doom. And if he believed that a Targaryen leader was going to remain on the Iron Throne no matter what, then his calculus regarding the rebellion once again makes more sense. After all, what do the deaths of a few dissident lords matter in comparison to the end of the world? Rhaegar's foolishness and bizarre fixation on fulfilling prophecy also makes more sense within this context. If he, like his father and all the Targaryen kings who came before him, was aware of this prophecy and operating under the belief that it was a guarantee that a Targaryen would be on the Iron Throne and needed to be ready to save the world when the time came, then disregarding the very real threat of the rebellion in order to enact his own interpretation of Aegon's vision is more comprehensible. But clearly, The potentially great irony of Aegon's prophecy, and the fact that all of these presumed mad Targaryens may have actually been simply acting on information in the way that they believed they needed to, is that not only were they all wrong, but they all actively destabilized the realm and destroyed the Targaryen dynasty while they were allegedly trying to save it. This is unfortunately a pattern that's all too familiar to fans of A Song of Ice and Fire and Game of Thrones. But to have such a spectacular example of the unreliability of prophecies and the way that people interpret them is fascinating. The obvious danger of getting overly consumed with the future to the point that you're causing chaos in the present is clear. But it's also an astounding insight into the reality that almost everyone interprets prophecy incorrectly. If the reigning Targaryens were doing what they did because they believed that either they were destined to stop the apocalypse, or what they were doing was in service of that goal, then they were obviously and objectively incorrect. The extreme actions of many Targaryen kings got a lot of people killed and horribly destabilized the realm from the beginning of their dynasty to the end. And if those actions were driven by Aegon's vision, then ultimately the all-consuming fixation on prophecy is literally what ended House Targaryen's control over Westeros. If we're even to assume Aegon's vision or his beliefs about it were true to begin with, which seems dubious both because Westeros managed to defeat the ice threat once with no Targaryen assistance, and because the character trope of the Chosen One seems like just the kind of archetype George R.R. Martin loves to subvert, then the Targaryens who controlled the Seven Kingdoms for centuries did nothing to actually bolster the defenses against this threat, and if anything, made it even more difficult for the future Chosen One to do what they were supposedly destined to. Whether you believe that Daenerys is the savior of mankind, Jon is the hero meant to protect the world, or that the notion of a singular messiah is absurd, clearly Jon and Daenerys have no knowledge of the coming doom as a result of this Targaryen prophecy. By the time the ice threat becomes a legitimate threat, this information has been lost because Aerys and Rhaegar likely both died with this secret, and their nonsense resulted in the perennially shaky Targaryen dynasty finally fully collapsing. Meaning that if we're to presume that Aegon's prophecy was an actual factor in the book story, all of the extremes that the Targaryens went to in service of it weren't just for naught, but actively made the situation worse. With that said, it's not a guarantee that George R.R. Martin was intending for this to be a part of the book canon. And even if he was, this is admittedly a great deal of information to extrapolate from one idea. However, it does make the entire Targaryen dynasty even more fascinating and really begs the question of whether the Targaryens were born mad, or if Aegon's vision for the future made them that way. But what do you think? Is this prophecy what made the Targaryen intervention in Westeros so chaotic and made their rulers act so bizarrely? Or are Aegon's predictions even going to be a factor in the books at all? Leave your comments and opinions below. And if you're interested in more content like this, like and subscribe.